Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the American Dream. Tonight we have a very interesting guest, Michael Goldman, who is president of Goldman Associates. He teaches at Suffolk University and Salem State University. But most importantly, he's been consulting with politicians almost his whole adult life. He has consulted with 7 presidential candidates, current former Speaker Tip O'Neill, Attorney General Maura Healey. He's a major political consultant to Mayor Marty Walsh, and he's consulted with several congressional candidates all around the country, and particularly in Massachusetts. So, Michael, what does a political consultant do? Now, first, let me say something. The purpose of this show is to let people in the audience know what goes on behind the scenes. We try to expand, what people would normally see or hear on TV. So all the little gems that you can reveal, we would be grateful. And he has many, believe me.
Well, a political consultant is a person who's hired by certain campaigns, usually congressional, senatorial, gubernatorial, large mayoral, like Mayor of Boston, Mayor of Philadelphia, Mayor of New York. And the expertise we bring to the campaign is used so that there can be a maximization of resources, particularly financial resources and the resources necessary to target voters. One of the things that most people don't realize is, particularly when they decide they want to run, they assume they're going to go out and knock at every door. There's a great joke that Tip O'Neill, the former speaker, used to tell about the guy who knocks at every door and wins, and the guy who knocks at every door and loses. And somebody who's thinking about running goes to the guy who wins and says, "How do you win?" And he says, looks around, he says, "You knock at every door." And goes to the guy who loses and says, "How do you win?" He looks around, he says, "I don't know, but the one thing you don't want to do is knock on every door." Well, you don't. Somebody like me makes sure that you don't knock at every door, that you only go to the doors of those people who are likely to be voters who voted in the past or voters who would be favorable to your position. And that's really what we do. We really try and maximize every single dollar in the campaign so that the candidate has the best opportunity in the end to win. Nothing's worse than wasting your time and wasting your money in a campaign. And unfortunately, that happens a lot, Jim, as you well know.
I do. So let me ask you a couple of questions.
Sure.
What's a focus group?
A focus group is a subset of survey research. Generally what happens is we will take a survey, and it'll be a survey of 300 to 400 people with a plus or minus of 4 points. And that gives us a 2-dimensional picture of what people are thinking. And by that I mean you could say, are you more likely or less likely to vote for Jim Carrigan if you knew X? If you knew that he had been a lawyer for his entire career, would that make you more likely or less likely? What the focus group does is we then take the results and we go into a small group of people who've been chosen because they have similarities. Either their incomes are the same, or their ethnicity is the same, or their gender is the same,
the population at large,
or their city is the same. And then we say, some of you may know that Jim Carrigan is a lawyer. He's been a lawyer for 40 years, and why do you think that's a good or bad thing? Because we already know that a majority of people think, for example, the polling shows it's a bad thing. We want to know why. And the focus group gives us the third dimension, gives us the answer to the question. And many times we discover things. I'll tell a little story here about a guy named Bob Reich who ran for governor back in 2002. And to our surprise, when we did our polling, there were 2 groups of people who were less likely to vote for Reich, who was a professor and had been a Secretary of Labor. One was Irish and Italian women making $30,000 or less a year. They were less likely to vote for him. And you sort of figured out, well, they look at a guy who's a professor at Brandeis University and says, what does he understand about the problems of people like me? And but the second group was more interesting. It was people who profiled just like Bob Reich. You would think that would be the group most likely to vote for him, and they were one of the groups that were least likely. So we went into a focus group, and we asked the question. Focus group is a very deliberative process, but we finally get to the question, and it turns out that none of the people who were like him thought they could be governor, thought that they could deal with the legislature, thought he'd be rolled by the smart, streetwise, Pauls from Lynn and Malden and whatever.
Yeah.
And so it made perfectly good sense. So we needed to, in that case, in our campaign, we made sure that voters knew that he had taken on Newt Gingrich, who was then the Speaker of the House, and won. People said, gee, if he could beat Newt Gingrich, he certainly could handle the legislature. Now, we never would have known that if we hadn't been able to take the focus group. It's fascinating stuff.
Have you found those results to be fairly consistent and successful?
Every race is the biggest mistake that people make that want to be political consultants is they try to replicate. When you have been in the business, and I have for over 45 years, the one thing that you need to do at the start of every race is forget everything specific about any other race. There are certain things you need to do, but if I look at Jim Carrigan and I say, oh, I know who he is. He's a lawyer from an urban area, Irish, progressive, and then I try to superimpose another candidate who was like him, I'll lose a race. And that's how people lose all the time. I have to look at Jim Carrigan as though he is brand new and fresh. And I look at the environment he runs in as though it's brand new and fresh, because it is. And oftentimes you'll have a situation where people who seem so alike, one will win and one will lose. The exact opposite candidate will win at the same time as somebody who shares none of his value systems. And people are always surprised about that. People like me, we understand that people have multiple needs they want to have filled. And sometimes they're filled from people on the left, sometimes by the right. Sometimes a woman seems like a good candidate, sometimes a man. Sometimes they're looking for someone who's tough, and sometimes they're looking for somebody who shows a big heart. And each race has to be handled like that. If you do that, your success rate is going to go up exponentially.
Okay. Let's go back to focus groups for a
Sure.
minute. How many people, if you take a sample of 300 or 400 people for a citywide poll, how many people do you need in a focus group?
12.
12.
That's it. What you need to do is make sure in the polling, you need to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to get into the survey. In a focus group, you're really reaching out to people who your polling has told you that demographic of people have a problem. And your assumption is if your focus group leader is smart enough, and there are terrific people who do these, that they can figure out how to get the information without leading them to a conclusion. That's the key. People who don't understand focus groups think it's easy. It's one of the most difficult things to do in politics, because it's so important that people come to the conclusion themselves. And again, very quickly, there was a famous race in Providence, Rhode Island. I was involved in the governor's race in Rhode Island, involving the former mayor of Providence, Buddy Cianci, who had done a very good job as mayor, but was perceived as being corrupt, and the then governor, a guy named Garrahy. And everyone loved Garrahy. Everyone thought he was terrific, and we did and Cianci had some problems in his marriage, so we did a commercial, and Garrahy, who was a grandfather, we had him out pushing his grandson on a swing and talking about family values and talking about how that's what Rhode Island needed. When we played the commercial, it was a complete dud. And we couldn't figure out why. So we called it a focus group, and we said to people, the focus group leader led him through, and what do you think about Cianci? Oh, he's not he did a good job, but I don't trust him. And what about Gary? He's always a great family guy. And so we asked the question, why do you think that, what are his weaknesses? And one person in the focus group finally said, you know, if he spent less time in his family and more time on the problems of people of Rhode Island, we'd be better off. We canned the commercial, and we did a commercial of him working at his desk very hard, the light on at night. So those are the kinds of things that you can, that no matter how smart you are, unless you trip over it, you can have a message that you think is incredibly effective. I think Hillary Clinton, to some degree, discovered that the polling told her one thing on the messaging, but it left out the other part, which is that she needed a message, in this case, I think, an economic message. They thought if they just went negative on Donald Trump, that they would win, and it wasn't enough.
Right. Well, how much was it? Let's talk about that.
In terms of?
Well, she lost the election.
Well, you know, again, something I'm going to say to your listeners, viewers here today is that she will come out of this race the most prolific vote getter among losers in the history of the United States of America. She will have won the race by the exact percentage that pollsters predicted, 2 points, by 2.6 million people. Right. Yeah. And he will have won the Electoral College by the smallest percentage. Out of 58 races, he will have come out 48th in the lowest number of the spread between the Electoral College. And in the end, it turned out to be about 70,000 votes in 3 states, which people like me wrongly thought were going to stay Democratic, and just barely broke away. I mean, in a mega multi-million vote contest, to basically have the race decided by that tiny percentage of people, it is heartbreaking if you're a Hillary person. And I would argue that they needed not only to say why Donald Trump shouldn't be president. They won that fight. 60% of the people leaving the polls that took part in the exit polling said that he was unqualified to be president, and 63% of the people said he was temperamentally unfit to be president. Those are 2 very different things. You can be qualified and temperamentally unfit, or you can be temperamentally unfit and not qualified. People in the end thought he couldn't do the job, thought he would do potentially a bad job, voted for him anyway, because Hillary Clinton didn't give them a rationale for why they should take a chance on her yet again. And that was, again, it's easy to be smart afterwards, but certainly I didn't see that coming at all.
Yeah, neither did I. So if we ever win back the presidency,
which we will,
which being Democrats, I'm going to be extremely empathetic to my Republican friends. I know how hard this hurts.
Well, it is. It's a very difficult thing, and we will. You know, I again to quote for a second time, that except for the birth of my daughters, one of the happiest nights of my life in my career was in 1992. The Democrats, I had worked for Bill Clinton, and he had won the presidency, and the Democrats had won the House and the Senate, which was more than we expected to do that day. People may remember it was a 3-person race. Clinton won with 42% of the vote, the speaker had retired 4 years before, and we were all just ecstatic. And I remember him saying, "Kid, be careful what you wish for." And 2 years later, we had Newt Gingrich, and we haven't recovered. Right. So, as painful as 2016 was, in 2 years we got races, and certainly in 4 years we run for president again, and the world can flip over just as easily as it did this time.
Who do you think the likely candidates will be 4 years from now?
You know, personally, I think that the party needs, with all due respect to Joe Biden, who will be 78 when the next race comes, and that generation, my generation, your generation of Democrats, we need to start to think about how we go back and capture what Barack Obama did, which was a new energy, a new sense of the Democratic Party. I think the new senator from California is an extraordinary candidate. Her name is Kamala Harris,
right.
And she's terrific. There's Juan Castro and his brother, who were Hispanic.
From Texas.
There's a lot of young Democratic talent out there. I think it may very well be somebody who right now would be perceived as a third-tier candidate at the outset of the race, like Barack Obama was.
Right.
And but I can't imagine it's going to be an institutional player, somebody that you and I either know well or have worked for in the past.
What about Cory Booker?
I think Cory Booker is interesting. I don't know that America is going to go with a black candidate, a black male, again for a while. And I say that not because there's anything wrong with black males. I would remind our viewers that in 1960, which I am old enough to remember, although I didn't work in the campaign, and John Kennedy won the race by a hair's breadth, 100,000 votes, but a much larger spread on the electoral college.
Yep.
And if you say to most Americans today, can a Catholic be president? They will say, of course a Catholic can be president. John Kennedy was president. Well, we haven't had a second Catholic president since 1960. 50 plus years. So we'll say, can we have a black male president? And people say, of course, we had Obama. But getting that second one in is very tough. I think it's more likely to be a black woman or a Hispanic candidate, just by the nature of how politics works. It's just hard for a minority to win two terms in a row. And again, I'm still waiting for the second Catholic.
This wouldn't be 2 terms in a row. Trump's
But I mean, a second win, meaning not
but
two.
Cory Booker spoke right here in this building in Lynn City Hall.
He's a terrific.
He's brilliant.
He's a brilliant guy, and he has a great story to tell. And
Yeah.
I don't say that because of him. I say it because I'm looking
I
at the
understand.
profile, not the individual.
Yeah.
You know, whether he likes it or not, like Catholic candidates that followed John Kennedy, they were always held to that, and John Kennedy was seen as so special. Well, Barack Obama is leaving office as strongly as any president in our lifetime.
Right.
And every other candidate's being measured against him, who looks like him and demographically. A woman or a black woman, a Hispanic, even another white male. I think just because of the nature of how politics works, is going to get a better run. Although, believe me, I think he would be a terrific candidate, probably a terrific president.
Okay.
But we had a lot of Catholics that we passed by in the last 50 years that would have been terrific presidents.
It may be they went the best candidate, though, right?
Some of them, they couldn't measure up to Jack Kennedy. That's the problem. Your point is well taken. Although I think Bobby Kennedy, maybe could have pulled off the miracle. Bob Kennedy.
Michael and I both worked for Bobby
Kennedy
Kennedy in the 1960s.
Right.
And,
but we've had other, pretty good,
yeah.
pretty good Catholic candidates
Yeah.
who, voters are tough. Voters are very
Bobby
tough.
Kennedy was stopped by a bullet. He might have gone all the way.
I said that. I said he was the one. He is the one that I think very well could have been
Right.
the anomaly. But again, it's interesting. You may remember in our lifetime how many people sort of profiled out. Bill Clinton was basically a John Kennedy candidate, although he was not a Catholic. He had the same charisma, if you will. He had the same look. The idea of being able to reach out. As you well know, having been involved in politics as long as you have, to get elected, you need to be able to do 3 things. You need to answer 3 questions. Does the candidate understand the problems of people like me? Does the candidate care about the problems of people like me? And what will the candidate do for me, not me as the individual, but my community, my family, my future? And those are 3 very separate things. You can understand and not care, and you can care but not really get it. And you can understand, care, and not be able to deliver. So the hard part is being able to convince people that you can do all 3. And in my lifetime, to be honest, Ted Kennedy was one of those people who, when we asked that question, does he understand? Absolutely. But he's a multimillionaire. He gets it. Does he care? Of course he cares. Look at what he's done. And can he deliver? Listen, his campaign theme was he can do more for Massachusetts. I would argue, not in a derogatory way, that John Kerry could show he cared and could show he delivered, but could never really convince people that he understood. They just thought that he was too rich, too empowered, too different than them. And he still got elected, but he didn't get elected with all three of the qualities. And so somebody like me is always looking. I would argue that Barack Obama successfully did all three, and to a horrible degree, to my dissatisfaction. Amazingly, a minority of people, but enough to win, thought that in the end, whatever his weaknesses, that Donald Trump would deliver for them. I don't think that's true.
No, that's going to be a big problem for him.
A huge problem. But
it's already becoming a problem, and he hasn't even taken office yet. But let's go back to polling for a minute.
Sure.
To talk about what you just said. Where do you get your sample for polling?
Well, and it's interesting you should say that, because we're obviously, given the fact that the polls, to some degree in the 3 states, overall the number turned out to be exactly correct. The 2-point spread was a 2-point spread nationally. But certainly the polling in Pennsylvania, the polling in Wisconsin, and the polling in what's the third state? Michigan, were off, because the polling had her winning all 3 of those and he won them. So what you do is you start off with an aggregate of people who are good voters. So when you're doing the polling, you choose your numbers without bias. Every telephone number gets thrown in the mix. And then you call the first number, and the person isn't home. That's okay. You didn't do anything to bias it. The second number you call, the phone is busy. It's not a bias, because you're not doing anything. The third person says, I'm really busy right now, I can't talk to you. There's no bias there, because they're choosing not to participate. And the fourth person makes it in. So each of those 4 people had an equal opportunity to get in the pool of voters. Then you ask what's called screening questions. So even though you say it's okay, the first thing you want to know, are you registered to vote? If you're not registered, I don't care what your viewpoint is. I got to have registered voters. Then if you're registered, do you intend to vote? Do you know what month? We always ask a third question, do you know what month primaries are in? If you're registered to vote and say you're going to vote but don't know that September is the primary, we exclude you, because we assume, even though you say it, you're not really. So we do things to try to end up with a sample which is reflective of who actually will participate in the election. And every good pollster has his own devices as to how many white people, how many black people, how many men, how many women, how many people from a city, how many people from the county, how many people from urban and suburban. And that's why all the polls are different, because everyone's sample is based on their own idea of who's going to participate. If you're off, like we were in Philadelphia, she lost Pennsylvania by 10,000 votes. There were 70,000 fewer Democratic votes out of Philadelphia than there were in 2012. So if we could have gotten just a little more of that vote out, she would have won in Pennsylvania easily.
So let me ask you a question. What if you poll, when you started out this morning,
Sure.
This afternoon, evening, you said that we look for people who vote in elections.
Right.
Right? Why don't you poll those people instead of trying to screen out people? Because people will sometimes lie about that. Oh, sure, I vote all the time.
No,
and they don't.
No, I'm saying you're screening people out so you only get the good voters.
I know you are.
Right. We don't care if someone isn't a voter.
No, I know that. What I'm saying is, why don't you just poll the good voters?
That's what we do. That's how the screens create
No,
the
I
good
mean
voter.
without the screen. Take actual voting list, people who voted.
In the end, because because when you have a voting list, you see a name.
It's a lot of work.
It's not just a lot of work. It's the problem that you have is you have the human element of it. The minute you see it's a woman versus a man, The minute you see it's an Italian versus Irish, if a name sounds black or sounds Hispanic, the person on the phone brings with them their own bias in how they ask the question. The key element of surveys is there is no bias because you don't know who's on the other end. So if you started with a list of names rather than a list of numbers, you would then have those biases played in. But in the end, most pollsters will tell you that doing it the way I described it, you end up with a good pool of voters because you've excluded people. Again, if David Paleologos, who I think is the best Massachusetts pollster were here, he would say to you that based on his record of surveys, he and the other pollsters do a darn good job of ending up with the right pool of voters. But you don't want to start, again, in any way, shape, or manner, putting anybody's predisposed biases on it, because that's how you end up with a bad survey.
Yeah. Okay, Pat Goodell did polling for me when I ran for the Senate, and we did 3 polls. First one we polled people who actually were super voters, voted all the time.
So you had a good voter list, which you can do in a small. I apologize. You can certainly do what you want to do if you're doing a state senate or a state rep race. You can't do it for a presidential race. That's very hard.
Okay. All right. So let's move on because we only have 1 minute left, and I wanted to.
So Pat Goodell.
I should have started with this question. Never mind. Let's leave Pat aside for a minute.
Okay.
What do you think the press should do? Should the press take a side when they see a candidate winning the election that they just strongly disagree with?
Well, I am of the school of political thought that says the truth matters. I think that the press's role is exactly as you described it. They ought to be the place where voters go, where they get to get an honest arbiter, judge, if you will. The problem today is we have universes of people who we can't get to any referee, any ground of saying who's right, who's wrong. Nobody trusts the religious leaders. Nobody trusts the newspapers. Nobody trusts scientists. Nobody trusts people that we used to go to say, well, who's right? And until we can bring back an arbiter who all the sides agrees has no vested interest other than to tell the truth, we will continue to have the problems that we have now. And the press should play that role. They should not be fearful of playing the role of truth teller.
Okay. Well, Michael, you've been really interesting. We
Always
could go
a
on
pleasure.
for days, and thank
do
you
it
very
again, I promise.
Yes, okay, good. That
Definitely.
will be a good idea. We'll pick
Perfect.
a topic. Thank you very much.